Hi, it's Adam from Impact Gamers, and we're back again with episode 2 of Thinking in Fusion. This episode is about player movement in Clickteam's games design software, Fusion 2.5. We're splitting player-controlled movement and computer-controlled movement to allow greater depth, so the episode on computer-controlled movement will follow. This section is getting on with the principles of games design, adding an object for the player, and getting the movement just right, because it affects nearly everything in the game you're making. The level size, the layout, the enemies, the artwork, the difficulty, so many things depend on the way that your character will move. So we're focusing on game feel for the player character movement. You can read about game feel in a great book called A Gamer's Design to Virtual Sensation, written by Steve Swink. So basically, we're looking for the connection between you playing the game and your character. You know when it's right, because when you dodge, duck, dip and dive through the obstacles in a level, you feel the fear, the excitement, the relief and the achievement of doing it, because you're the one in control. And you can feel when it's wrong, because you don't feel in charge of the character. This often happens to me when playing a beat-em-up or a sports game. You end up button mashing and really feel no connection with the player. You sometimes wonder whether they're CPU controlled or your controller's unplugged. So here's the sections coming up in this episode. So let's have a look at what's coming up. To start off, as always, we have the summaries. Then we'll be looking at the controls and how to add events for those in depth, how to set up your player object ready for movement, and this section also includes about multiple movement types. The non-physical player movements, the physical player movements, good practice for dealing with mouse-controlled objects, screen boundaries and scrolling, and platform obstacles, which is covering platforms, ladders, obstacles, and then the physics specifics, which sounds like an odd nursery rhyme, but isn't. Finally, there's an epilogue just mentioning about movement extensions.
In the world of physics, where atoms dance and twirl, let's explore the wonders, let our minds unfurl.
But isn't. Controls summary. So Clickteam has built into it that there can be 4 players, and the default controls for all 4 players are the same. You've got the cursor keys, the arrow keys, up, down, left, right, and then you've got fire buttons 1 to 4 being Shift, Control, Space, and Enter. Now these can be changed in the application properties, in the runtime options, but they can also be changed in-game if you're making a Windows game or just a Clickteam game, under File and Players, or Control and Y. You can see from there it also supports up to 4 joystick inputs. Check out the more in-depth section at this timecode. Movement summary. For an active object, in the Properties toolbar, under Movement, you can add multiple movement types. Types are broken down into non-physical movement and physical movement. The main difference of this is that non-physical movement is a retro-style way of dealing with direction. You have 32 different directions, and then for physics movement, it works off degrees. So you have 360 degrees, but you can also have a fraction of a degree, allowing for super smooth rotation or direction. Physical movement also allows for forces to be able to affect the object's movement. The free version and the full version have the same amount of non-physical movement types, those being 8 directions, race car and platform. Just a word of warning about mouse-controlled movement. Clickteam will set a limited area for the mouse to be able to be moved in. And so you won't actually be able to close your application using the mouse. You'll have to hold Alt and press F4 for the Windows shortcut to close, or build in an event on a key press like Escape to end the application. Personally, I do not recommend using mouse-controlled movement. There's better options that we cover in the in-depth section at this timecode. For physical movement, these follow the laws of physics and have to have a physics engine in your frame before any of the movement will work. The free version almost has as many as the full version, but you don't get physics axial movement in the free version. The physical movements, those types that can be used for player control, are physics 8 directions movement, physics platform movement, physics race car movement, and physics spaceship movement. There are some movement extensions at the bottom. These aren't player controlled, but in the full version you have the ability to add in even more extensions covered at this time code. And to point out that boundaries and scrolling is covered in the more in-depth section here. Now we'll move on to looking at those things in detail. Controls and input events. So let's have a look at how we can set the default controls for each player. If we have the application selected and go into its properties toolbar, under runtime options, scroll down to right near the bottom and you have default controls and you can press edit. This grid signifies what default device will be for each player. So if we had 4 joysticks plugged into our computer, we could assign joystick 1 to player 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3, and 4 to 4. Now, if those joysticks aren't connected, then the keyboard defaults would override and would be able to control by keyboard. So if joystick 1 wasn't plugged in, the keyboard defaults would kick in. To edit the keyboard defaults, you just need to click on the square underneath the player that you want to change the keyboard controls for. So it's this square for player 1. To change the default control, you click the button and then press a key on the keyboard. Up, down, left, right. Each player can have 4 different fire buttons. Be aware that button 1 and button 2 are the most important buttons to specify, as certain controls, such as platform movement, only allows button 1 or 2 to be an independent jump control. Also be aware that many keyboards don't support more than 3 or 4 key presses at the same time. This means that if you had all 4 players playing on the keyboard, some key presses might get ignored. You'll have to test that out with your own particular keyboard. But for 1 or 2 player games, this often isn't an issue. If you want joystick input to be the default again, you'll just need to re-tick the box. Windows has quite a nice feature for USB game controllers, so you can see how many joysticks are assigned and what number they are. You can access that from the Start menu under Setup USB Game Controllers. Once your controls are set up and your character object has a movement type, those controls, those inputs, will automatically control your character for the movement. So there's no need to add any events in the event editor. But if you ever want to, if you go to the event editor and new condition, underneath the player 1 object, which looks like this in the full version, but this in the free version, under joystick, even though you may be using keyboard controls, it's under joystick, you can choose read joystick state, which checks if a button is pressed and is an instantaneous event, or repeat while joystick is pressed, which is a continuous event. So the actions for that condition will keep on applying. When you select read joystick state, it defaults to have the up button selected. To select or unselect a direction, just click on the square that you want to adjust. Note you can only choose one direction for the condition. Diagonals are activated if a player presses 2 directions at the same time, such as up and left, or up and right, down and left, down and right. You can, though, select multiple fire buttons and a direction to go with it. So you could have that if the player presses down, button 1 and button 2. But quite often you'll want to deselect your direction and just choose which fire button is being used, as directions are already set up for movement. You might want to have a fire button to trigger a non-movement, such as an attack or a shield, or pick up or drop, or enter building action. And just remember, it's going to be a green instantaneous rule for read joystick state, and a black continuous rule, repeat while joystick is pressed. You can also negate the repeat while joystick is pressed to check that a player isn't pressing that button. As always, you can insert conditions to check multiple conditions being true. So you can actually check that the player isn't pressing any buttons with this condition. one extra thing to point out is the actions for the player control allows you to ignore player control and to restore player control, in effect ignoring the keyboard or joystick inputs for that player. You may find that you don't have the objects for players 2, 3, 4 in your event editor. So if I remove the objects P2, 3 and 4 from my frame editor and go back into the event editor, there's only player 1. These will automatically be added to your event editors when you have an object that is controlled by another player. And it will also add in all of the players in between. So if we insert a new active object with a movement that's controlled by player 4 and go back to the event editor, you'll see I now have the full range of players 1, 2, 3 and 4, even without adding the other player characters for player 2 and player 3. That can be useful if you want to use score and lives for players that don't exist for another aspect of the game. And we'll show you why that's useful in the video about counters. So that's an in-depth look at the controls and inputs. Now into setting up your player object. So setting up for a player character, insert a new active object. It will always be active. Name your object. We always recommend calling them P1. This means it won't be confused with the player objects, and if you ever clone it, the numbers will increment, so it'll be P1, P2, P3, P4 to apply to the other players. It's always a great idea at this point to decide the scale of your player. Now this will relate to your application window, so decide your application size, and then from that decide your player size. Fusion 2.5 is set up to handle lots of smaller objects, but if you start to add in active objects with a high resolution, active objects above 250,000 pixels, so that's 500 by 500, you may notice slowdown. Don't try and make something in high definition just for the sake of it being in high definition, unless you're really certain about the game that you want to make. I'd recommend starting at a widescreen ratio, but much lower size. So something like 960 by 540. To change the player size, you can click on it once it's already selected. So that may be click once to select, wait, and click again. And then drag the squares to the right size. Now artwork will be covered in a later section, but for what's called grey boxing and just checking that things work, it's always a good idea for your character to start off as a box. So if you go into the image editor, covered in the previous video about the frame editor, use the white piece of paper to clear it and fill it in a colour. And we recommend green or some kind of positive colour that you can easily see on your background. Having the character filled in completely allows you to work out the spacing and the collisions and the gaps in your level that you'll need. Okay, so just before we look at the actual movement types, we'll look at this movement number in the movement section in the properties toolbar. You can have multiple movements for an object, and to add them in, click on the movement number and then press the plus minus button. Here you can choose this icon for create new movement. If you want to remove a movement, you can click delete movement, and you can change the order or the names of those movements. These movements are independent to each other, meaning you have to switch to the movement you want. They won't all apply at the same time. Just the movement type that's selected will apply to that object at that time. This is useful for in a game if you have a character who's platform movement, but then if there's water and the character swims, you might want to switch from platform movement to 8 direction. And then in the event editor, under the actions for that active object under movement, under multiple movements, you can then choose the action to change the movement. One thing to note is that when you change movement types, that resets the movement for the player. It's as if they started the frame. So their speed will drop to 0 and their initial direction will be set. If it's important to maintain their speed, or for physics movement, their force, you'll need to use some counters or alterable values to pass that information over to the new movement. Alterable values are covered in the next session. Okay, now let's get into the movement types. Starting off with the simplest, 8 directions. Now, with all these movements, you will have an option for which player controls that character, that object. For 8 directions, you can actually limit the amount of directions from 8 by clicking on those numbers to any particular amount of directions you want. So where the arrow exists, that is a direction that's valid. So just selecting the left and right would only allow the player to move left and right. Initial direction is the direction that the object faces when the game starts. By default, any active object only has one direction in its picture editor, and that is to the right. Direction 0. You can use the slide bar at the bottom of the picture editor to add in to the direction compass and add in different animation frames for different directions, but we're covering that in a later video. Getting back to the movement properties, we have speed. This is the maximum speed your player can achieve. Deceleration, how quickly the player will come to a stop when you're not moving. And acceleration, how quickly to get up to the maximum speed. Now this is a little more of an art than a science, but it basically is, if your character doesn't go fast enough, increase the speed. If they feel that they're a bit slidey when they're stopping, then increase the deceleration. If they feel a bit laggy when to get to full speed, increase the acceleration. Setting the deceleration and acceleration to the maximums, which is 250 on the slide bar, but you can type in a higher number, will mean it can instantly stop, instantly start at full speed, but that might not feel realistic to the character. The moving at the start option isn't really relevant because unless you're pressing a button, you won't move. Stick to obstacles means that if you have a backdrop object with the runtime type of obstacle, that's covered later at this timecode, when you collide with it and stop, you won't be able to slide past it, you will stick to it, you'll stop to it. And here it is with stick to obstacles off, which is the default. There's a little bounce back, allowing you to slide past, but no way as near as much as bounce. Collisions with actives and backdrops is covered later at this timecode. The try movement button will allow you to try the movement, but won't run any of the events of the frame. So if you're checking for the way that it interacts, it's far better to just run your application or your frame. Now, race car movement has very similar options, but the control style is quite different. Again, we've got which player controls it and the initial direction, and we have a choice of 32 here, which is the full range of non-physical movement directions. We have speed, acceleration, deceleration, meaning the exact same thing as 8 direction, but the movement is controlled by a left rotation when you press left and a right rotation when you press right. Hold it down and you'll spin round on the spot. Then if you press up, you'll go forwards and accelerate. If you press down, you'll brake to go slower. Hold down when stopped to reverse if that's enabled. We can only see this direction change because the object has animation frames for these directions. If your object has one frame, then the movement will look like this, no rotation being shown. So to resolve this, we'll load up the picture editor, slide the slider under the sort of direction compass up to 32. You can draw your character facing to the right. I'd suggest just adding an arrow to your rectangle at this point. If you right click on that direction in the compass and click Create Rotated Directions, then when you test your game, you'll be able to see actually which way you're facing. Now that we have 3D games more regularly, this top-down view is not a very usual movement type. Race car movement is really useful for retro-style games like Micro Machines or Super Skid Marks, even a basic Asteroid game. Enable Reverse allows that if you brake enough, then you can actually go into reverse, the number of angles you can face, and the rotating speed. The higher the rotating speed, the faster you can turn. But once again, remember you can turn on the spot, a bit like a tank. But you could always code some events to affect the rotation speed. You could have a condition saying that if the speed is equal to 0, then the action is that the movement of that active object, the rotation speed, is set to 0, and then another new event a condition that if the speed is greater than 0, then you can set the rotation speed to the number that you want. But that's all quite advanced. The final non-physical movement is platform movement. Again, you have the player, the initial direction. This time we only have a choice of 4. Speed, acceleration and deceleration, the same as before. Moving at start. But you have gravity and then jump strength and the control. Gravity is how quickly you accelerate downwards. Strength is your jump height, so they affect each other. If you feel that you're a bit floaty, you could increase the gravity. That means your jump strength will need to increase to allow you to jump as high as you did before. By default, the jump strength is set very low, so I recommend turning that up to about 80 or higher. The control is what button will make you jump. See the control section earlier, but button 1 by default is shift, and Windows annoyingly has sticky keys if you press shift 5 times. So if you jump 5 times in a row, you might get this accessibility notification about sticky keys. If you just go to the ease of access center and deselect those toggles, then that will stop that from happening. But if it is an issue that you want other people to play the game on Windows, I would recommend changing button 1 to a different button, as shown before in the control section. Platform movement needs to have platforms or boundaries in place for it to actually work, otherwise you just fall off screen. This is all covered at a later section at this time code. Those are the non-physical movements. Now let's have a look at the physical movements. Well, let's get physical. Let's get physical. Physical movements. So, as said in the summary, these are more modern style of movements that have angled direction and also allow forces to affect their movement. That may be hitting into another object, it might be a fan or some other kind of force. So physics 8 direction movement, as with all these physics movements, will require us to add a physics engine object into our frame. This object represents all of the code of the world, sort of the gravity and the way things behave in it. It has an engine ID as well, which allows us to have multiple physics engines so that different objects can obey different physical laws. But one physics engine is all we need to test all the movements. So physics 8 direction movement is very similar to the normal 8 directions, but we have this rotation speed, meaning that our character automatically rotates to the direction we're going. Now with physics objects need to be calculated for rotation and collisions around the hotspot. The hotspot is where Clickteam Fusion 2.5 measures things from. And so it needs to be in the center of the mass. Now there's a nice quick shortcut for that in the picture editor, you can go to the hotspot, which looks like this in the free version, and this in the full version, and you can just press the C button to put it in the center of mass. But for physics platform movement, the hotspot actually goes bottom center. We'll cover that later. Setting the rotation speed to a low number will mean it takes a while before the character faces the right direction, and setting it to a high number means it will rotate quickly to the direction it's traveling. You can type in a very high number to mean that it's almost instantaneous and more similar to the non-physical 8 direction movement. But the specifics to physics.
In the world of physics, where atoms dance and twirl, let's explore the wonders, let our minds unfurl.
But the specifics to physics is they have things called density, friction, elasticity and gravity scale. Now density is how much of something is packed into it, how much mass there is. So a balloon and a bowling ball could share the same shape, the same volume, but they have very different densities. The balloon will float on water, the bowling ball will sink. You throw the balloon to a friend, they may catch it or hit it back. You throw the bowling ball at a friend and you get arrested. So density is how much is packed in, and this density is calculated per pixel. So if I have a circle that's quite large, and then I clone it to have an exact copy with the same density, but make it smaller, the density is the same, but there's less pixels, so the mass is smaller, meaning it needs less of a force to make it move. The more mass something has, the harder it is to move, and the more density is more mass per pixel. So friction is how the object behaves when it hits another object, when it collides. This is a percentage, so 0 is 0%, 100 being 100%. A friction of 0 will make it just slide like ice straight off, and a friction of 100 will make it stop when it collides with another object, more like rubber. Elasticity is how much of the force reflects back. This also is a percentage, 0% meaning that when the object stops, it just stops dead, but 100% would mean that the same force and energy that went into hitting the object reflects back, making it elastic. That's not realistic in real life. Everything's less than 100. And also avoid going over 100. This is a percentage. You don't want it every time it bounces, it gains energy. That ends up with this kind of chaos. But most objects in the real world have some type of elasticity. If you were to drop them on the floor, they would shuffle a bit or bounce a bit. Every object with a physical movement can have its own gravity scale, even if it's sharing the same physics engine. So a gravity scale of 0 is that this object is like it's in deep space, it floats. There is 0 gravity, it will not move in the direction of gravity. A gravity scale of 100 will be 100% of whatever the gravity is in the physics engine. And you can go as large as you like by typing in your number. You can add joints into your physics objects. We won't be covering that in depth here. But the engine ID specifies which physics engine you're using, by default 0. And the collision shape, this is really useful. Is it the shape of the first image in your animation frames, in your picture editor? Or is it a box or a circle? If you want your object to collide in a more kind of regular way, or if you need your object to stack, box works well, especially if the artwork fills the whole picture. If you need it to roll, then circle, but shape of first image works well as long as the animations in your object don't change size too much. Extended collisions in physical movements means that the collision detection is more precise. Auto rotations means that you don't need to draw all of the different directions in the picture editor. It will automatically generate them. And then smooth rotations. So if your image looks a bit pixely or ugly when it's rotating, you can tick this box. But be aware, it does use more processing. And again, we will cover collisions with active and backdrop objects at this time code. Make sure you try your movement, and I always recommend not clicking try movement, but running your application or your frame to give it a go. Okay, physics platform movement. We get the warning that you must set the hotspot of our object to its feet when using platform movement. Now this is specific to platform movement, and if we don't do this, it means our player will sink into the platforms and also collisions will be off. So as we said before, in the picture editor, you can go into hotspot. There's a quick shortcut in that little grid of bottom center, and you can click there. A quick tip, if you need to set multiple hotspots to the same space, if you hold down Alt while changing the hotspot, then that means that every animation frame will be updated with those new coordinates for the hotspot. And once again, the origin of hotspots, like it is for coordinates in Clickteam, is top left, not bottom left. Once you've set the hotspot, you have choices which players controlled, the initial direction, speed, acceleration, deceleration as normal, but then you can use acceleration while changing directions, meaning that if you're running to the right and then you hold left, then you will keep on sliding to the right as you go back to the left. So Mario does this in his platformers, and it just gives you a bigger sense of speed. But if you don't like it, uncheck that box. Climbing speed means that when you're on a ladder, this is the speed you'll travel. Allow crouch and speed when crouched means that if you hold the down button, you'll automatically crouch if you're on a platform or an obstacle. Jump strength, the same as non-physical movement, but this is how much force you put into your jump. Multiple jumps means that you can have as many jumps as you like, but it's set on triple jump, meaning you can jump once, but in the air, you can jump 2 more times. You can check or uncheck jumping when crouched. And then you can have it that when you release the jump button, that you don't jump as high for applying deceleration. The control, you're limited to button 1, button 2, or pressing up in a direction, up and left, up and right. And then if you can actually move in the air while you're jumping, which is quite common for platform games. And then again, we have the density, how much mass there is, elasticity, how much you bounce, and gravity scale, which is naturally set at 350%. One thing to be aware of with physics platform movement is that the forces of that object can be passed to other objects, but the forces from other objects can't be passed to them. So if a big boulder is rolling at them, it can push them along, but it can't knock them over or send them flying like it could with other physics movement types. The same with physics movement events. Actions of applying a force or an impulse don't affect physics platform movement objects. In the advanced section, we've got the mask width. Now, this is a percentage of the character's width that you want to use for collisions into the world. Because the collision mask for platform is only box, it might mean that your character, as soon as their fingertip touches something, it interacts, and you might not want it to do that. You might want it to be in the center of the character. Got extended collisions for more precise collisions, and the engine ID for which physics engine we're using, but it's 0. Race car movement. When we select this, we can choose player, initial direction, and by default it's very similar to the other racing controls. So we've got the rotation speed, acceleration, deceleration, and allow reverse. We've got the extra physics settings of density, friction, and elasticity that we've covered before, but we have auto rotations naturally turned on. So this is actually a really nice way of doing top-down racing, because we only need to draw one animation frame pointing to the right, and then the rest are automatically calculated. Physics spaceship movement. Now, this is realistically race car movement, but we don't just have the option of up for accelerate. We can use fire button 1, fire button 2, or we can use up. The settings by default are slightly different for spaceship movement because we start off with 0 deceleration, meaning that if we boost and let go, we will keep on going at that speed. If we boost again, we will accelerate, but keep on going at that new speed. Also with spaceship movement, we don't have a top speed. So if we keep on boosting that thruster, we will keep on adding power and power to our speed. Everything else we've covered before, physics of density, friction, elasticity, and gravity scale. Joints we're not going to cover in this specific video. See the previous video about physics 8 direction movement for an explanation about all that. Right, mouse movement. I've kept this separate because, as I said in the summary, mouse movement locks the area the mouse can move and actually sort of breaks the way that we can close the application without using Alt F4. The cursor, the mouse pointer itself in Clickteam, isn't an object we can control. The mouse pointer relays information to Clickteam about its position. To be able to utilize it well, it's best that we create an active object that replaces the cursor or is invisible by going to its display option properties and unchecking visible at start. But either way, we can use that as a cursor. In the event editor, we can add a new condition, special, always, so that it always runs. We can then set the position, set the X coordinate, and then gather the information from the mouse pointer of the current X position of mouse. So that's X mouse, which sounds like an absolutely rubbish Marvel hero. Then do the same for the Y position on the same action. So underneath the active that will be our cursor, right click, position, but this time set Y coordinate, and we'll set it to the current Y position of the mouse. That's Y mouse, which sounds like X mouse's sidekick. So now that active object will travel around with the mouse cursor. We can also, either at start of frame, new condition, the chessboard start of frame, within the always, either one, we can, under the mouse pointer and keyboard actions, we can hide the Windows mouse pointer. So we can hide the cursor. This new active object is very useful for us. It means that when we move our cursor outside of our frame, we get it back within Windows, so we can close our application. We can get other active objects to face its direction or to travel towards it. So it's much more powerful than just having the mouse pointer. We do need to be aware that it's always connected to the mouse pointer's location. So if we move our mouse pointer, our cursor, far enough from our frame, the object will get destroyed and we'll end up without an object to check where it is. So what we'll do is close the test application, and within the runtime properties of that object, we will uncheck destroy if too far from frame. That way it will always exist and it will behave like a cursor. In the picture editor, we can make it look like a cursor or a target, whatever we want to do, and we can put the hotspot in the location that we actually want to check. Now for conditions, I would still recommend using the mouse for those conditions rather than your cursor because it's more precise. So we have options for the mouse user clicks, repeat while mouse key is pressed, user clicks on an object. All those three are useful for adding events into the game. And when you choose one of them, such as user clicks, this is a one-off on the click rather than a continuous event for repeat when mouse key is pressed. We get the choice of which button. Is it the left, the middle, or the right, a single or a double click? And then we can trigger an action. We can also combine and insert two conditions. So you can have a repeat while mouse key is pressed and have it check for mouse pointer over an object. And so that way that you can have it that as you hold over an object, something repeatedly happens, such as a counter increases for reloading. And we're looking at counters in the next episode. The next section, we'll look at screen boundaries and scrolling. Screen boundaries and scrolling. Well, we all need boundaries in life, and definitely we need boundaries for our player character. If we were to leave the frame, we instantly break that game feel. We are not in control of a character we can't see. So for the boundaries, this is done in the event editor or the event list editor. A new condition to do with your player character, position, and it's not under collision. The edge of the screen is a virtual thing. So it's to do with position, test position of that object. Then this representation comes up of the frame area, the white area, the play area, and the grey area outside. We want to select the movement direction of leaving that frame area. So there's 4 arrows around the edge showing that we will be leaving the frame area and going outside. So inside the white box on the edges, those 4 arrows. The other arrows represent entering the play area or being outside the play area or inside the play area. But we want an instantaneous green condition to happen as soon as we try to leave the area. So those 4 arrows and OK. Now, in movement, if you haven't got any movement selected, these will be grayed out. So make sure you've already set a movement type for your active object. And the appropriate responses, unless you just want to destroy the character, which seems harsh. But anyway, the appropriate responses for movement are to stop the object, as in all of the movement stops. You just hit the wall and you stop. Bounce, you ricochet off, and wrap around play area, which is like a teleportation to the other side. You leave on the left, you arrive on the right, you leave on the bottom, you arrive on the top. Now these can't be combined. So if you try to do a stop, then a bounce, you will already be stopped. You won't have any speed in order to achieve the bounce. The same as stop and wrap around play area or bounce and wrap around play area. Just the first one will action and the other one won't be able to. So you'll have to right click on your action and delete it, or drag a blank box over the top and re-add the movement action that you want. Now, if you want to be able to travel in a larger world, you can set your frame to have a larger size than your application. And this is covered when we talk about the frame editor in video 1. So if we set it to have a larger size than our applications window, we have this extra space. But if we move outside of our frame, we still disappear, because the boundaries of leaving the frame area, leaving the larger box, not the smaller box that represents the applications window. So in our event editor or event list editor, we can add a new condition, and it needs to be always. So on the cogs and then special, always. Then underneath the storyboard controls, the chessboard, if we right click for an action on that row, we can click scrolling, center window position in frame. Then we can choose what it's following, what the camera will scroll to. And so we can choose relative to and choose the object that's the player character. Now when we test that, we'll be able to move. You might not notice the movement if you've got a plain white background. So you can add in some images from backdrop objects, or a quick backdrop with a type of motif, draw a floor, and then you get a tiled texture when you stretch it out. So you can actually see the scrolling taking place. Then when you hit the edge of the frame, your chosen action will trigger. Be aware that wrap around the play area doesn't work with physics objects. You'll need to code the condition about the X and Y coordinates being less than 0 or greater than the frame width. Anyways, it's probably best just to avoid physics objects wrapping around a play area. As said before with the mouse movement, if an active object travels too far from the frame, by default, it is destroyed. Collisions including platforms. Now there are 3 different types of obstacles that get used with platform movement. So if I insert a backdrop, and this also works with quick backdrops, in their properties, in their runtime options, I can choose an obstacle type, and they work like this. Obstacle can't be passed through by the player character. A platform can be landed on and can also be jumped upwards through or walked sideways through, but the collision only works when you fall down onto a platform. But a platform allows you to jump up onto it and land on it. And then a ladder, as long as the player's feet, that is the location of the hotspot, which should be positioned in the bottom center for any platform movement, is on top of the ladder, you can travel up and down. But if the ladder doesn't reach their feet, you'll have to jump to get to the next section. Ladders also can be used sideways, so they can be used like cargo nets. And finally, ladders override obstacles or platforms. So if you put an obstacle on a ladder, you'll be able to travel through it. Now, there's one line of code that needs to be in place for this to work. After you've got a backdrop in your game with an obstacle type and a player character with platform movement, in the event editor, go to new condition, go to the P1 character, your player's character, collision, backdrop. Then, under your P1 character, choose the action of movement and stop. And it needs to be that specifically. Now, anything that's a platform in the game, an obstacle in the game, or a ladder in the game will behave as such. But without that event, no collisions will work. There's also an option of collision with box, meaning that its collision mask will be the full height and width of pixels, no matter what you've drawn in it. There are options for physical obstacles, and that's if you add an active object in and choose the movement type of physics background. Within that, you have the choice of what type of obstacle, but you don't have a ladder, you just have obstacle and platform. And this movement type means that it can't actually move, it acts like a backdrop, but interacts well with the physics world. Event conditions and actions can't affect an individual backdrop object, but they can affect active objects. So the physics background movement allows you to use an active object in your game acting like a backdrop. Also in the event editor, you can convert active objects into backdrop object masks, using them like a stamp to make a backdrop object that looks identical to the active object, but can have an obstacle type to become a platform or a ladder, or even remove a collision of background. So one thing to point out is that backdrop objects use much less memory, so you can have many more backdrop objects in your game than active objects, and it won't slow the gameplay down at all. So on to movement extensions. This isn't available in the free version, but if you go to create new object and go to the manager, you can see that there's other types of movement that people have created, and you can see which platforms it will run on. All of them will work in Clickteam, but publishing, it tells you which ones they can build into. So that sums it up. Different player movements that you can quickly apply, tweak to get the game feel right, and start the game making journey. Next session, we're going to be looking at counters. See you then.